Here's the skipper, ladies and gentlemen. We may already be aware of this, however, we are experiencing a little engine issue. When a pilot tells a white lie, it sounds like this. The little issue that Cathay Pacific Flight 780's Captain Malcolm Waters is referring to is that one of the aircraft's engines has quit, while the other is stuck on high power and won't slow down. The likelihood that the 309 people on board this aircraft will crash into the South China Sea in a matter of minutes is very high, even though they are unaware of it. The two Australians' expertise and collaboration are the only things preventing them from reaching that result. Pilots in the cockpit, each minute counting down. Their plane's state deteriorates. Will they get in Hong Kong before their engines completely fail? The pilots were never prepared for this scenario, and there is no established protocol in place. This is the account of Flight 780 on Cathay Pacific. Cathay Pacific Flight 780 got ready to take off from its gate at Juranda International Airport in Surabaya, Indonesia, early on April 13, 2010, in order to make the 5-hour flight to Hong Kong, boarding with 13 crew members and 309 passengers. The aircraft in use. There was an 11-year-old Airbus A330 used for this voyage. This was one of more than 30 of them in Cathay's fleet at the time. With more than 1,000 of these popular medium to long-haul aircraft in operation globally in 2010, the A330 is a popular aircraft. On this flight, there are 2 pilots in the cockpit. The night before, they had flown this aircraft into Sur and spent the night in a local hotel. Malcolm Waters, the 35-year-old captain, had spent the previous 12 years employed by Cathay Pacific. 2,500 of his more than 7,000 flight hours were spent on the A330. David Hayhoe, the first officer, was 37 years old, with a little over 4,000 hours of flying experience, 1,000 of which were things the A330 was carrying. He had spent 11 years in the Australian Air Force, where he gained the majority of his prior flying experience. When the airplane landed in Surabaya the night before, it still had 9,000 kilos of gasoline on board. For the remaining 24,000 kilos of gasoline needed for the 3,500 kilometer to Hong Kong, the captain gave the order to take on more fuel. This day's weather was ideal for flying. There was no indication as the pilots taxied their aircraft to the runway that this would be anything other than a regular trip, even though the forecast called for clear skies on the way. The crew and passengers were unaware that they were in serious danger. What would happen to the pilots over the next few hours deal with a series of escalating warnings from their onboard computers. These would appear benign at first, but would culminate in a nightmare scenario that they had never been trained for. Flight 780 lifted off from runway 28 at Surabaya at 8:24 local time. The first officer was flying the aircraft back to Hong Kong, and the captain was handling radio communications. The first sign that something was amiss came during the climb, when the pilots noticed that the engine instruments showed abnormal EPR fluctuations for the number 2 engine. The one on the right-hand side of the aircraft, EPO, stands for engine pressure ratio, which is a measure of the difference in pressure between the front of the engine and the back. The pilot's instruments indicated that the engine was having some difficulty maintaining the proper thrust output, which is indicated by the EPO, which is a measure of the engine's thrust output. Unusual readings were also coming from the aircraft's number 1 engine on the left side, but they were more concentrated than the variations coming from engine number 2. Just before 9 in the morning, when the aircraft was level at 39,000 feet, there was the first hint that this anomaly might be significant. On the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System, or ECAM, a warning appeared saying Engine 2 Control System fault. This system also displayed the message engine to slow response, meaning that Engine 2 would now be slow to respond to movements of the thrust lever. Captain Walters wanted to clarify the significance of these warnings, so we contacted Cathay Pacific's Operations Center for technical advice. The maintenance engineer on the other end of the line asked the pilots to move the thrust levers and see how the engines responded. They did this and noted that the EPR was still fluctuating, however, because the other engine parameters were normal. The crew decided to continue the flight to Hong Kong. About an hour later, the Engine 2 Control System fault warning reappeared on the ECAM, along with the warning advising the pilots to avoid rapid thrust changes. The pilots turned on the engine anti-air system to see if this would fix the abnormal EPR readings, but this had no effect. They contacted maintenance control again and informed them that the EPR fluctuations had now become larger. They inquired as to whether it would be safe to go on to Hong Kong. On the other end of the line, the maintenance control engineer conjectured that the EPR instability on engine number 1, it could be the outcome of the flight computer attempting to make up for the second engine's instability. To put it another way, engine number 2 might have been the only one having issues. He informed the flight crew that the fuel metering unit, which regulates the quantity of gasoline given to the engines, would be replaced when they got to Hong Kong, and urged them to keep an eye on the engine characteristics. For the following 2 hours, the flight proceeded essentially according to schedule. As far as the pilots were concerned, the engine readings were unusual but nothing to be concerned about. In their minds, they would soon be landing in Hong Kong as normal, and it would be maintenance. His job to deal with the engine trouble once they had parked at the gate. A 1:20 in the afternoon, Hong Kong time. The plane was about 110 nautical miles from the airport on its initial descent. From this moment onwards, the crew's situation will get progressively worse. As the plane was descending through 30,000 ft, the captain reported hearing a light pop sound, which was followed by the smell of ozone and a burning smell in the cockpit. This was quickly followed by 2 new iChat messages. Engine 1 control system fault and critically, Engine 2 stall. The second warning about an engine stall was particularly troublesome. The flight crew followed standard procedure for an engine stall and reduced the power on Engine 2 to flight idle, the low setting that keeps the engine running. The ECAM then displayed new warnings for Engine 1, which read Engine 1, slow response and avoid rapid thrust changes. These were the same warnings they had received for Engine 2 previously. To compensate for the reduced thrust from Engine 2, the crew pushed the Engine 1 thrust lever to the setting known in Airbus aircraft as MCT, or maximum continuous thrust. This is the highest thrust setting. The engine can stay out for a prolonged period of time. However, despite this, Engine 1 never reached this thrust output. Rather, it moved up a little from its previous position before falling down to roughly 37%. The aircraft crew was now confronted with a major issue as they were still more than 100 miles from their goal. Their second engine was operating far too slowly, and the one that was stalling had to be run on the lowest level. They wouldn't be able to stay aloft if their engines were not powerful enough. They were now heading straight into the South China Sea in slow motion. In lieu of declaring an emergency, the captain called Hong Kong Air Traffic Control and made a pan-pan declaration. The pilots had conducted an approach briefing earlier for a normal arrival at Hong Kong, but they now had to quickly change plan. They briefed for what's known as a one-engine inoperative approach, and also briefed the missed approach procedures in case their first approach was unsuccessful. Eager to get on the ground before the situation deteriorated further, they requested a shortened path to the runway for air traffic control, which was granted. Captain Waters went on the PA system and told the flight attendants to prepare for landing. He also briefed the chief cabin crew member, known as the in-flight service manager, about the engine problems. He then took over from the first officer as the pilot flying, given the fact that they were operating on one engine now. As the plane continued its descent, the crew received permission from air traffic control to maintain high speed so that they could make it to the airport as soon as possible. Having gone through all the relevant checklists, the captain recapped the situation to the first officer and asked if there was anything else they might not be thinking about. The pilots agreed that they had covered all the necessary details, however, and that their task now lay in landing the crippled aircraft. It was now looking as if the situation had stabilized. The pilots had briefed for a single engine approach, and the aircraft was approximately 50 nautical miles from the runway. But by 1:30 in the afternoon, everything really started to go south again. There was a notice to the pilots that Engine 1 had now stalled. Now that their circumstances were dire, the first officer called air traffic control on a mayday, saying in approaching mayday, mayday, mayday 780, how to fix the stalling of engines 1 and 2. For now, we need to keep the descent low at 8,000. After being given the all-clear to drop to 3,000 feet, the crew started going through their checklist to handle with the stalled engine, just as they had done with the other engine minutes earlier. They moved the thrust lever for Engine 1 to the idle position. The aircraft was now essentially a giant glider. If the pilots were going to have any chance of landing in Hong Kong, they had to get at least one of their engines working. They were still in the clouds at this point, and the speed was steadily decreasing. Disconnecting the autopilot, the captain was now operating the aircraft manually and attempting to maintain its green speed of 202 knots. The speed that guarantees the longest glide distance in the event that the engines fail is known as the green dot speed on Airbus. This is the reason it served as the inspiration for this YouTube channel's name, as you may have observed. One by one, the captain moved the thrust levers to test the engine's controllability. The plane would reach Hong Kong if he could get one engine running. Worried that there would be no electricity if the engines got any worse, the pilots turned on the auxiliary power unit. Finally, the aircraft broke out of the clouds and the pilots were able to get a better picture of where they were. Air traffic control then advised the pilots as to how to get to the airport quickly. Cathay 780. Roger, on your present. Heading there will bring you a close base around Lantau Island. I'll advise if this is only if you're too close. Cathay 780. Roger. I can't see Lantau for cloud, but we've got this island just to the southeast of the airfield. 780. Roger. Your present heading is the most sufficient to miss the Lantau Island and still make the right base. Cathay 780. Roger. Having tested each of the thrust levers, Captain Waters discovered that Engine 1 still responded somewhat. So he decided to use this engine to keep the aircraft flying. He also set the engine start switch to ignition to reduce the chances that the engine would flame out when it was needed most. As the aircraft approaches the airport, the speed at which it was approaching this section was too high. Thus, the captain began to retract the thrust lever on the main engine, but the engine was not starting. Walters kept the thrust lever in the idle position by pulling it back, but the engine remained at its high 74% setting. This was a significant issue. Now one engine was virtually dead, and the other was stuck on a high thrust setting. Now more quickly than their aircraft was built for, and more quickly than they had ever been prepared for, this crew would have to attempt a landing. There was less risk that they would crash outside of the runway into the sea, but that they would overrun the runway and end up in the sea anyway. The first officer told the flight attendants to prepare for a possible evacuation. The captain then made a PA to the passengers, telling them that there was a small problem with the engines and urged them to fasten your seatbelts to help slow the aircraft down. The crew extended the speed brakes, which are flaps that pop up from the top of the wings and disrupt the airflow in order to put more distance between himself and the runway and to give himself more time to slow down. The captain started to zigzag the aircraft. The plane was not slowing down, however. The overspeed warning began to sound as the aircraft reached 244 knots, indicating that the aircraft was at risk of structural damage due to how fast it was going. Air traffic control then cleared the aircraft to land. At a distance of 3 miles from the runway and at 1,000 feet above the water. As they plummeted through 900 feet, the aircraft continued to fly at 230 knots, which is nearly twice the typical final approach speed. Even though the speed brakes were keeping the vehicle from going faster, the crew nonetheless stowed them. They couldn't stay for much longer since doing so would cause the plane to land with an excessively harsh landing on the runway. When the first officer inquired about setting the flaps to 2, the captain said that would be worth a try, as it might slow the aircraft down somewhat, even though it risked damaging the flaps. At this moment, the terrain alarm sounded as the aircraft was descending rapidly towards the ground, while not in a normal landing configuration. The overspeed warning sounded again as the aircraft was traveling too fast for the flap setting that had been selected. The captain's full attention was on making sure that the plane didn't impact too hard so that he could maintain control of it, as it careened down the runway at 15 minutes to 2 in the afternoon. The aircraft slammed down onto the runway at a speed of 231 knots, or 426 km/h, almost twice the normal landing speed. It bounced and then hit the ground again, this time scraping the left engine against the runway. The spoiler is deployed automatically and the captain deployed the thrust reversers, but only the number 1 engine thrust reverser deployed successfully. He stepped on the brakes, which reached temperatures above 1,000 degrees C and began to glow. The aircraft continued to skid along the runway and was rapidly running out of space. Finally, after a 2.5-kilometer fight to stop the aircraft, the pilots finally brought it to rest just 309 meters from the end of the runway. Everyone on board had survived the ordeal, but now there was a new problem. After shutting down the engines, the pilots looked at the brake temperatures. They had reached the top of the scale on their instruments, which was 995 degrees CC. The fire crew, which had arrived at the aircraft, reported that they could see smoke and a fire on the landing gear, and the captain quickly gave the order to evacuate. In the end, 56 passengers received minor injuries in the evacuation, and one passenger fractured and dislocated their left ankle and required hospitalization for surgery. The high-speed landing itself did not result in any injuries. 13 members of the crew and 309 passengers made it through the ordeal alive. It is difficult to exaggerate the amazing feat that this landing represented. The crew encountered a completely new set of failures for which they were untrained, yet they remained composed and carried on working together really well as they approached Hong Kong. Throughout the entire experience, they made wise decisions and safely landed the plane, which very well might have ended up in the ocean, in honor of their accomplishment. The International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations presented Captain Walters and First Officer Hayhoe with the Polaris Award, the highest honor in civil aviation. In the same good light as this tale turned out, however, the question remained as to what had caused all this in the first place. How could a modern aircraft like the A330 suffer such a catastrophic failure? The suspicion of investigators quickly fell on the fuel when they closely examined the engines and fuel tanks. They made a shocking discovery. Many engine components were clogged with thousands of tiny spheres made of super-absorbent polymer material, or SAP. After examining the chemical composition of these spheres, investigators determined that they could only have one source: the fuel pump itself, back at Serbia. Specifically, they found that they must have come from part of the fuel pump known as the filter monitor. The filter monitor acts, as the name suggests, like a filter, ensuring that trace amounts of water and other particles in the fuel being pumped from the below-ground tanks do not make it to the aircraft's fuel tanks. The filter monitor is almost like a series of coffee filters stacked on top of one another, with each layer filtering out a different kind of material. Part of this filter consists of a superabsorbent polymer layer, whose function is to absorb any water from the fuel being passed through it and absorbing this water. But this substance swells and becomes almost gel-like. This is a photo of the materials swelling into a gel taken from the final report. Under normal conditions, this substance expands to the point where it actually clogs the filter and shuts off the aircraft's supply of water-contaminated gasoline if there is enough water in the fuel. So why did Cathay Flight 780 experience none of this? How did this substance get into the aircraft's fuel tanks? Upon closer inspection, detectives found that this material had been exposed to more than just regular water, such as fuel. It turned out that the fuel contained salt water. It is well known that salt water weakens the filter's inherent capacity to shut off when it's overloaded with water. Investigators concluded that as the aircraft was being fueled, the SAP material in the filter swelled and congealed due to the presence of large amounts of water, and that as fueling continued, the high pressure of the pump pushed the SAP out through the filter and into the fuel, where it formed tiny spheres as the engines ran throughout the flight. These spheres clogged up the fuel metering units, which controlled the amount of fuel entering the engines. This caused them to get stuck on a particular thrust setting. Ironically, this SAP material, the very thing that was meant to remove contaminants from the fuel, ended up being a contaminant. The person who carried out the aircraft fueling did not investigate when on numerous occasions during the fueling. There was significant vibration in the hose, as well as an increase in differential pressure in the fueling system. This should have alerted him to the fact that something was amiss, but he ignored these telltale signs and simply stopped and restarted the fueling. Every time this happened, more and more fuel laced with SAP and salt water was pumped into the aircraft's tanks. In order to determine the source of the salt water, investigators discovered that many underground fuel pipes had been replaced during periods of intense rain when the massive steel pipes were measured, cut, and then resealed at the Surabaya refuel station. A neighboring overflowing pond seeped water into the fuel lines. A number of recommendations were made in the fund report with the goal of enhancing both the oversight of fuel quality monitoring and the aircraft fueling processes at Toronto Airport. Suspected engine fuel system contamination is a new section that Airbus included to the A330 Pilot's Quick Reference Handbook to assist pilots in identifying and handling tainted fuel. Ultimately, it's astounding that this accident's lessons were discovered without a single person dying. With special appreciation to YouTubers and Patreon backers who helped make this video possible. By pressing on the links here on the screen, you may contribute to the expansion of Green Dot Aviation. Your support would be greatly appreciated. I would also want to express my gratitude to Andrew Glove and Angela Penny for their kind donations. With any luck, you liked this video. Once again, I appreciate your time, and I'll see you next week for another episode.